benvinguts i benvingudes. Tornem a fer altre any i per tercer cop consecutiu l'edició del Seminari sobre models de política de defensa i enguany la primera ponent és la professora Elisabeth Braw del Royal United Service Institute, un dels think tanks més prestigiosos que hi ha actualment a nivell mundial sobre política de defensa. De fet, si no el coneixeu, va ser fundat, entre altres, pel duc de Wellington. Imagino que són... I think Duke was the founder of the Russia.
Yes.
Doncs, i ella dirigeix el programa de Deterrence sobre com funciona el tema de dissuasió en l'actualitat de noves i velles amenaces. I alhora també un dels temes que volem tractar és el paper actual de les dones en les institucions militars. En tot cas, la professora Braw ens farà una perspectiva holística i crec que és molt d'agrair i això, com sempre, hi haurà primer una presentació i després torn de preguntes. En qualsevol cas, professora Braw, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. I took off my mask because I'll be talking for a while, not with any sort of disrespect for the rules. In fact, I truly believe that everybody can do their part to keep the country safe. So, as I think Paul said, I lead something called Modern Deterrence, the Modern Deterrence project at RUSI. And Modern Deterrence, you might ask, what's that all about? Well, it's about finding ways of convincing those who wish our societies ill that it would be a bad idea to do so. And how do we convince those who wish us ill that it would be a bad idea to try to harm us? We do so by showing that their aggression won't be very successful. So, and that's also what I'll talk about tonight. And so I want to ask first, I hope we can, even though you're a bit spread out, I hope we can get a lively discussion going. So I wanted to ask, so I spend my time thinking about national security threats. So I wanted to ask what the threats are to Catalonia today or to Spain today. Is there anybody who would like to maybe mention a couple of threats to the region or to the country? No, there are no threats to... Oh, there are threats. Sorry? Economic warfare. I'm very glad you mentioned that because I'm going to mention it as well. Any other threats that you're concerned about? Okay. Sorry? Social insecurity? Cyber security, cyber. Okay, I'm very glad you mentioned that because I'm going to mention it as well. So we've got two things already. And I ask because when most people think about national security, they think about, now she's going to talk about, how many tanks do we need, how many frigates do we need. My argument is, and I think this is where the world is heading, it's not about military equipment anymore. Yes, countries need military equipment as well, but what they need is to defend themselves against the sort of things that you mentioned, economic aggression, or what I call weaponization of globalization, or as you mentioned, cyber aggression. And this is not something that we can think about, it might happen in 10 years' time, 15 years' time. That's what we think about when we look at military aggression. It may happen. It's pretty unlikely. Of course, we need to defend ourselves anyway, but it's pretty unlikely that our countries here, NATO members, will be militarily attacked by an adversary. But we don't need to imagine these forms of aggression, weaponization of globalization, cyber attacks, subversion of civil society, disinformation, all of that is already happening, and we haven't found a way to defend ourselves against it. And how do I know we haven't found a way of defending ourselves against it? Because it keeps happening and it keeps growing. And in fact, it will keep growing until we establish this modern deterrence, the way of communicating, an effective way of communicating to our adversaries. that they shouldn't bother with us because they won't achieve what they want. So let me just start with a video here, and I'm glad the signal is working.
Never forget, it was the 27th of June when I was woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning. A call came from the office that we had suffered a cyber attack, and then a process started, which I'll talk a little bit about. Now, before we go into the details of the attack itself, A.P. Møller-Mærsk is the largest container shipping company in the world. We transport roughly 20% of world trade in containers, so we're a very significant part of the infrastructure of making the world actually run. And every 15 minutes, on average, a container ship will come to a port somewhere with between 10 and 20,000 containers. So now you understand the criticality of infrastructure. We were hit by the non-patch virus. In fact, that meant that we were actually collateral damage of a probably a state attack situation. The impact of that was that we basically found that we had to reinstall an entire infrastructure. We had to install 4,000 new servers, 45,000 new PCs, 2,500 applications, and that was done.
Okay, they had to reinstall their entire IT infrastructure. Who is familiar with this case? So the gentleman speaking here, his name is Jim Hagemann Snabe. He is chairman of Maersk, which, as he described, is the world's largest container shipping company. Without Maersk, we wouldn't get our food, or at least most of our food. We wouldn't get most of the daily supplies we need. Maersk transports, as he described, 20% of the world's goods. And as we all know, globalization means that almost everything we consume is transported from another country, and it travels very far distances. And in June 2017, which was what Mr. Snabe described here, Maersk was hit by a virus. At first, it looked like ransomware, where somebody wanted Maersk to pay money for that organization to release the IT infrastructure. It turned out it wasn't ransomware at all. It was, as he said, a state attack. It was later established that this NotPetya virus originated with a hacker group working on behalf of the Russian government. It was originally targeted against Ukrainian companies, Ukrainian government agencies. Then it traveled on and hit Maersk, which went dark for several days. And that was obviously a disaster for Maersk itself, but it was also a disaster for consumers, companies around the world, because if we don't get our goods via Maersk, we will very soon see the consequences in supermarkets, in wherever we shop, and in distribution centers all over the world. So this was a very serious attack, but it wasn't just Maersk that was hit. Merck, which is an American a global pharmaceutical company based in the US, was shut down as well by this virus. It was unable to produce vaccines, including a vaccine against the human HPV, that's how it's abbreviated. It's a cancer medication. Merck was unable to produce that and had to go to the US government to get the entire the government's entire emergency supply in order to keep its production going. Mondelez, which is a global snack giant, was hit. So if you eat, I'm sure you don't eat snacks, but if you do, you will have eaten Mondelez products, Oreo cookies, Nabisco crisps, and so forth. That's Mondelez. They were hit. Lots of other companies were hit as well. The damages were in the billions of dollars. And what was interesting was, as you saw Jim Snabe say here, we were the collateral victim of a state attack. So businesses in the area of cyber attacks, businesses are on the front line of aggression as nations square off against each other. And interestingly, Mondelez, which was also hit by the virus, the snack giants, they requested insurance payout from their insurer Zurich, and Zurich said, no, it was an act of war, so your insurance isn't valid. This is the way the insurance works. I wouldn't want to bother you with insurance terminology, but this is really interesting. So insurance, when you buy insurance for what have you, home insurance, health insurance, and so forth, car insurance, that all works under ordinary circumstances. If a war kicks in, all of that ceases to function. And so Mondelez had cyber insurance, and Zurich said, no, this is an act of war. It was attributed to a government, so your insurance is not valid. This is the new reality today, and it's not just these companies, not just this cyber attack. As we all know, cyber attacks are increasing, and companies are the front line because you can cause a lot of damage if you attack a company. And the company no company is as powerful as a national government. No company has the resources of a national government in defending itself, and it's also not allowed to attack back if it's attacked with with a virus or other cyber attack. So it's very easy to attack companies, and I often have presentations, or I'm asked to give presentations to company executives, and they are bewildered by this because they are used to preparing for different contingencies, including hostage situations, strikes, earthquakes, and what have you. But they don't have a tradition of preparing and defending themselves against attacks that aren't directed against them, and contingencies or crises where they are not, nobody wants to harm them, it's just that they happen to be on the front line. So we're seeing that cyber attacks. Then disinformation, I know you're all familiar with disinformation, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's part of a wider form of aggression that is that I refer to as subversion of civil society. And that can include, well, it includes disinformation, it also includes election interference, and there are a number of examples of that. For example, the Brexit referendum where Russia interfered to spread disinformation. It's, of course, it has affected the 2016 US election. Can I ask, does anybody think that elections here in Spain or Catalonia have been affected or have been targeted by disinformation or other forms of interference in the elections themselves? Or are your elections, do you feel they are completely clean? Okay. Did everybody hear? So Americans think that Russia meddled with your referendum. Yeah. Any other comments? So that's the reality we live with today. We can't know whether another country meddled with our elections and referendums. And my perspective is this. So we can't know even if we know that Russia did use disinformation, even if we know that Russia did hack, or other countries as well, even if we know that they did hack the election system, even if we know that they spread disinformation, we can't know how many votes that changed. But it doesn't, from my perspective, it doesn't even matter, because what matters is that people lose faith in their elections. So let me give you a couple of statistics here. A majority of Americans believe that Russia interfered in the 2016 elections. And in the UK, 47% of people believe that Russia interfered in the Brexit referendum. Only 23% of people in the UK believe that Russia did not interfere. And a new poll, or new as of this spring, from The Economist, the YouGov, showed that a majority of Americans don't think that a country can defend itself against foreign interference in the upcoming election. This is really serious. I mean, the elections are the foundation of our democracies. If people don't believe that our elections are clean and safe anymore, we lose the pillar of our democracy. People won't trust the outcome of the election. People won't respect the people the representatives who emerge from that election. So this is really serious business. And when people talk about, oh, we need to spend so and so much on defense, yes, that's true. But what we need to fix in the first place is the integrity of our civil society so that we can be sure that civil society is safe from this sort of harmful behavior by our adversaries. And it's quite painful to watch how divided America is. And that's something that Russia has fed into. Not just Russia, China and Iran are said to be attacking election infrastructure as well. But it's as a hostile country, you don't really need to do a lot if there's already tension within that country. You can just exploit it, and that's what's happening. And America is so terribly divided. I want to move on to the area that you mentioned, which is predatory economics, or I call it weaponization of globalization. Is anybody else, apart from you, are you familiar with weaponization of globalization? So the way that globalization works is that advanced countries and emerging economies agree that they will trade openly so that any company can export to any other country, and with minimal barriers. And that works well because we get really cheap goods, and as Maersk shows, I mean, we transport things around the world every single minute of every single day. And as a result, for example, this laptop probably was about half the price that it was. In fact, I remember buying my first laptop I won't tell you how old I am, but they were significantly more expensive then than they are now. And why is that? It's because they are produced much more cheaply in low-cost countries, and they are sent around the world several times. So the different components are put together in different parts of the world, and they are assembled in somewhere else and sent to us, and it's very cheap and very convenient. But globalization works if everybody plays by the rules, and that's what's no longer the case. And here, where Russia is the primary culprit in spreading disinformation, the primary culprit in weaponizing globalization is China. So a very quick couple of examples. China has, for example, or it subsidizes its companies, it props them up financially to give them a leg up against Western competitors, and lo and behold, that helps them edge those competitors out of business, or at least to limit their market share. That has happened in, the best example is solar panels, where, remember, we used to produce solar panels in Europe, then all of a sudden Chinese companies were producing them much more cheaply. Now our solar panel industry in Europe is virtually non-existent. That happened not least thanks to government support from the Chinese government for its domestic companies. It's happening in other areas as well. For example, stainless steel, completely unglamorous sector, but we need stainless steel for almost every aspect of daily life, including cutlery, surgical instruments, aeroplanes, defense equipment. That sector is being undermined, again, by the Chinese government in cooperation with its companies. But the most interesting aspect of weaponization of globalization is something called Made in China 2025. Have you heard about that, since you mentioned weaponization of globalization? Okay, you have heard about it. Who else has heard about it? Okay, so Made in China 2025 is the Chinese government's plan for China to become the world's economic superpower. And how do you become an economic superpower? You obviously promote your own companies, but we in the West have knowledge, know-how, expertise that Chinese companies just don't have. So what has happened in the past few years is that Chinese companies have been buying up cutting-edge Western companies in the areas that are the focus of Made in China 2025. So things like biotech, healthcare technology, AI. They've been buying up those companies which then become part of the Chinese business infrastructure. They refocus they change their focus to China. They are part of Chinese companies, as I mentioned. Space is another such area. And there have been a number of really interesting cases. So, for example, in 2016, a German company called KUKA, which nobody here will be familiar with because it's a relatively small company. They make industrial robots, not the sort of thing that you and I would sort of buy off the shelves. In 2016, KUKA, which is a cutting-edge industrial robot maker, was acquired by a Chinese company, and that was fine. I mean, the German government can't watch every single acquisition, and so it didn't pay attention to this one. Well, all of a sudden, this really unique company with unique expertise in industrial robot making was a Chinese company servicing in the Chinese market. That made the German government wake up, and it's made its legislation, or it's strengthened its legislation. So now it's significantly harder for non-EU companies to buy up German companies. But other countries haven't been as quick in reacting to this acquisition trend. So, for example, last year, Chinese companies bought up several, again, small Swedish space startups with, again, cutting-edge technology. And lo and behold, now they are Chinese companies. And the Swedish government it even approved the sale. It didn't think twice about selling them, because that's how globalization works. Any company can buy any other company as long as it's not a threat to national security. Well, this is a threat to national security, because we are losing this phenomenal expertise, know-how, entrepreneurial environments that we have fostered through our higher education, in fact, our primary and secondary education as well. For many, many years, we are losing that because it's so easy to just buy up our companies. Another example, and then I'll move on to what we can do about it. But just to illustrate how national security is changing, 2 years ago, a Chinese company bought something called Grindr, which is an app and a website. Is anybody here familiar with Grindr? Nobody. So it's a gay dating website, and the US government has a regulator called CFIUS that is in charge of preventing acquisitions of companies where the acquisition could be harmful to US national security. Well, why would the regulator care about the acquisition of a gay dating app? That's not national security, right? Well, it is national security, because as the regulator subsequently realized, all that data that Grindr has, 3 million daily users, could, as a result of that Chinese acquisition, be used by the Chinese government, and it would be extremely uncomfortable for the people who have data on Grindr, who are members on Grindr, to have the Chinese government have access to that data and possibly use it to blackmail them or what have you. It's not a very nice thought to consider the Chinese government having access to that data. So, in a very rare move, CFIUS, so the regulator, forced the Chinese buyer to sell Grindr again, and which it did, because if the US government tells you have to sell a company, and obviously you have to comply with the law, so the Chinese buyer did that. Grindr has just been acquired by a new buyer. It's an American company, but it was just revealed, Reuters just reported, the new buyer is, yes, it's an American company. It's based in Delaware, which is the tax haven in the US. And it's a completely new company, something like, called something very sort of California. But the owners are affiliated with the original Chinese buyer. So this is where national security is today, where the government has to watch the acquisitions of gay dating apps to make sure they don't land in the wrong hands. And now it looks like Grindr has in fact landed in a Chinese company with a Chinese, hasn't been acquired by a Chinese company, but it's now affiliated with our original buyer again. So all of this is very concerning and some might say depressing. I think it's a wake-up call, and I think it's a call for us to think, for us as citizens, whether or not we are interested in the armed forces. it's a call for us to think about national security and how it affects us, because all of this has nothing to do with attacks on the armed forces. It has everything to do with disruption of our daily life. If we don't have this cutting-edge technology, we won't be able to keep having the comfortable lifestyle that we have today, because all that expertise will be lost to our countries. Cyber attacks will obviously cause and have already caused disruption to daily life, and as we have discussed, disinformation, subversion of civil society is already causing enormous harm to our societies. And just a quick note, I'm not suggesting that it's just Russia and China and various other countries that we consider adversaries or rivals that engage in this sort of activity. The West has engaged in subversion of other countries too, and for example, the CIA interfered in the election 1948 in Italy on behalf of the Christian Democrats. The Americans interfered again in the election in Serbia in 2000. The CIA has interfered in various elections in South America and Latin America during the Cold War. So we are not squeaky clean, we as the West, but we are a great deal cleaner than the other side. And I'm not saying we should engage in the same sort of behavior towards them that they engage in towards us, but we should collectively try to keep our country safe, because it's in everybody's interest that we can maintain our way of life. So how do we do that? It starts with easy things, and here is a really clever thing that the Swedish government has done. Let me just show you one video that demonstrates the division that results from not being able to trust our elections, from not having the confidence that our elections are safe. And here we have our friend Donald Trump again on the issue.
Democrat crusades. By the way, I think they're starting another one. Did you see that? I see these phonies, the do-nothing Democrats. They said today that Putin wants to be sure that Trump gets elected. Here we go again. Here we go again. Did you see it? A story. Aren't people bored? Now, does that include, because a couple of weeks ago, Crooked Hillary said Chelsea Gabbard, right? Tulsi Gabbard, and, right? She was a Russian agent, Tulsi. And also Stein, from Jill Stein. I don't know Jill Stein. I never met the woman. She is a Green Party candidate, or was. They said she's an agent of Russia. Now, I don't know her, and I don't know Tulsi. The only thing I know about both of them is they're not agent. They are not agents of Russia. These people are sick. I was told that was happening. I was told a week ago.
So that's where we are today, where we can't have elections without having to worry that somebody is an agent of Russia, and then somebody else will say, oh no, he or she is not an agent of Russia. And by the way, is the information that we are receiving, is it safe? How do we know it's safe? How do we know it's accurate? And by the way, are our election systems safe? But now I want to come to the positive part, which is what we do about it and how we set ourselves up as societies to keep our countries safe. And 2 years ago, the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency produced and then sent to every household in the country a leaflet called "If Crisis or War Comes," and it describes in very easy bullet point form, bulletproof too probably, bullet point form, what sort of threats face Sweden today, and how ordinary Swedes, so everybody in the country, how they can prepare. So what you need to have at home in case there is a cyber attack, or in case there is other disruption where it means that you won't be able to get your daily food from the grocery store. There is a power cut, communications are cut, if the internet goes down. All of that, and I encourage you to visit, well, you can Google, not now, but later, you can Google if crisis or war comes. Really useful advice there from the Swedish government to the whole population. And it was, I think, very clever of them to send it to the whole population and not just put it online where you then have to, if the internet goes down, you're not going to be able to access the leaflet online. If you receive it in the mail, you have it in your house and you can consult it if a crisis comes. And that's a small initiative, but one that has already been copied by other countries. I think Latvia and Lithuania have both produced similar leaflets now. And I was just on a call with the former administrator of FEMA, so the Federal Emergency Management Agency, who said, and I said to him, well, the UK government, for example, claims that if we were to provide information like that, people would panic. And he said, I have yet to see any research that suggests that shows that people panic if they're given uncomfortable information. They won't like receiving it, but they won't panic. And if they panic, it's much better to panic ahead of the crisis than during the crisis. And so that's something that can be done. And can I just ask, would you know what to do in case the power went out for 24 hours? Yeah, that's usually that's usually the reaction I get. I mean, it's so, we feel it's so inconceivable, but it's not inconceivable. If it's not a cyber attack, it's Mother Nature. Extreme weather events will cause loss of power. We're already seeing it in California, for example, where it's not just power lines, but transformer stations are being eaten up by those wildfires. So that means that we have to count not just, or to realize that power can go out not just for 72 hours, which is sort of a standard measure in emergency management. Now, US authorities are already talking about people being without power for 7 days. That's a very long time. Then it's not just a matter of lighting candles and charging your phone somewhere. It's a matter of, you have no way of refrigerating your food. Your food, as a result, goes bad. You obviously can't cook. And it's very interesting that Swedish television has picked up on this. They have a new reality show that follows a group of people, and they are taken to a house, and they think it will be sort of a Robinson-like show where they're supposed to compete and throw each other out of the house. The power goes out. They are without power for 7 days. It is really quite shocking how dependent we are on power, and how helpless we are if we don't have it. So if you speak Swedish, and even if you don't, because it's mostly visual, I recommend this reality show. So, by the way, this is a new national security where reality TV also plays a role, or where it can help us understand the threats against our society. Another thing that's being done, and here I want to come back to sort of more traditional national security, because what can be done is that you innovate in your national security apparatus, namely primarily the armed forces. And here again, Sweden is a good example. During the Cold War, Sweden had something, or starting in World War II, actually, Sweden had something called total defense, which meant that everybody had a role to play in keeping the country safe back then against territorial invasion, starting with Nazi Germany, then the Soviet Union. If you're a small country with small armed forces, you have to involve everybody in keeping the country safe. And that could be small things like lending your vehicle to the armed forces. If you were a farmer, you could lend your tractor, because tractors are very useful in transporting equipment. Or if you were an ordinary citizen, you could lend your car. All of that was highly organized in this total defense system. Then, after the Cold War, it was dismantled and to almost minimal, almost non-existent levels. Now it's being built up again, and this year, starting last year and throughout this year, the Swedish, Sweden, led by the Armed Forces and the Civil Contingencies Agency, is conducting a total defense exercise, which is really phenomenal. It involves around 400 organizations, so government at all levels, obviously the armed forces, but civilian agencies as well, national government, regional government, local government, companies, volunteer organizations, and they are practicing a crisis scenario and what everybody would do, because it's not enough to just want to do it or to think about what your organization, your company would do in a crisis. You do have to exercise it. And so I want to show you this video.
Sverige bygger upp totalförsvaret. Om Sverige utsätts för ett väpnat angrepp kommer vi att försvara oss. Vårt samhälle måste kunna stå emot svåra påfrestningar och vi kommer se till att alla viktiga delar av samhället kan fortsätta att fungera. Det gäller till exempel vatten, el, livsmedelsförsörjning och sjukvård. Civilbefolkningen ska skyddas, liksom vår demokrati och våra mänskliga fri- och rättigheter. Lag och ordning ska gälla. Det militära och civila försvaret bildar tillsammans totalförsvaret. Alla måste känna till sin roll och vad de ska göra om vi blir angripna. Därför övar vi totalförsvaret under slutet av 2019 och under hela 2020. Totalförsvarsövningen leds och samordnas av Försvarsmakten och MSB, Myndigheten för samhällsskydd och beredskap. Försvarsmakten, myndigheter, länsstyrelser, kommuner, regioner och andra kommer att öva att tillsammans försvara vårt land, vårt samhälle och vår civilbefolkning. Roller, ansvar och beslutsprocesser kommer att övas. Vi övar att skapa gemensamma lägesbilder och hur resurser och verksamhet ska fördelas så att det militära försvaret och samhällets nödvändiga delar kan fortsätta att fungera. Vi övar på hur allmänheten ska hållas informerad. Vi övar på våra arbetsplatser och vi övar i fält. Tillsammans försvarar vi Sverige och varandra. Tillsammans är vi totalförsvaret.
So we got the translation in the end. And that is, I think, a fantastic illustration of what can be done. Even if you have small armed forces, and I don't think anybody would want armed forces that are active in every part of society. But if every part of society is vulnerable to harm and aggression, let's involve all parts of society in keeping it safe. And that's exactly what total defense is about. And you'll see a mix of men and women, for example. This is also something that is changing in national security. Threats are changing. The people involved in keeping the country safe are changing. So companies, the wider population, and even within the armed forces this is changing. If we look at, for example, Norway, which has a similar history to Sweden, it's for many years had something called competitive national service. Unlike many other countries, it didn't do away with national service after the end of the Cold War. It kept it, but it cut the numbers quite significantly. So during the Cold War, almost everybody, every able-bodied man and able-minded man had to do military service. Then the Norwegian armed forces, like all our other armed forces, didn't need as many soldiers anymore, but rather than abolishing national service altogether, it cut the number of soldiers. So the armed forces took 1/3 roughly of all young men. Then in 2016, the armed forces, or actually Parliament, decided why should we just choose between the men? Let's assess the women too. So now, in 2016, Norway introduced gender-neutral national service, which was the first time that had been done in any country other than Israel. In Israel, everybody has to serve. In Norway, they still take the same number of soldiers, which means that the competition for places is now twice as hard. And so if you're a 19-year-old Norwegian, if you're bright and fit, you have a go. I mean, you have a chance of being selected for national service, which is exactly how it should be. The armed forces get the best and the brightest, and these young people who are selected get a fantastic entry on their CV, and they also get good training. And it also means that a wide section of society is involved in national security. Ordinarily, when you have all professional armed forces, it's sort of people who are already interested in military matters apply to or join as soldiers or officers. But I think in most societies, there's a much wider range of people who could be interested if they just saw what the armed forces are about. Well, how are they going to find out? In Norway, they find out through these assessments that are run over several days and quite comprehensive. You learn what it is the armed forces do. And so as a result, lots of young people who wouldn't ordinarily have thought about the armed forces are selected for national service. And in some cases, they choose to stay on for a military career. In many cases, they choose to go back to civilian life. But in both cases, they are an asset to national security. And that's a path I think is a very healthy one. And again, just as is the case with many people who are interested, who don't have a background in national security or military matters, they might become interested. They do become interested. It's the same thing with those 50% of the population, i.e. women, who in past generations have played a large role in armed forces. In Norway, they now have the same chance of being selected, and they have also had, as professionals, they've had access to all forms, all roles within the armed forces since 1988, which meant that Norway was the first country to permit women to all roles within the armed forces. But again, women aren't going to be interested if they don't have a background of sort of interacting with the armed forces. This way they do. And as a result, the Norwegians have increased. So as I mentioned, they've had women, all roles have been open to women since 1988, but they discovered in this past decade that the percentage of women within the armed forces was still quite low, even though they could apply for any specialty within the armed forces, but there just weren't enough women interested. And this gender-neutral conscription has increased the number of women who are interested in serving in the armed forces and who join the armed forces. And I have to mention something really fascinating that the Norwegians have done as part of this really conscious effort to utilize the whole width of the Norwegian population in national security. So the Norwegians had special forces in Afghanistan. They have very good special forces. And as you know, special forces are the go-to specialty in counterinsurgencies, and they're just very skilled at dealing with it. But the Norwegian Special Forces discovered that it was a big or a huge liability for them to deal with Afghan counterinsurgencies or the Afghan counterinsurgency without being able to interact with the female part of the Afghan population, which as a male soldier you just can't interact with Afghan women. So, and that's something that all forces or all countries or armed forces that had troops or have troops in Afghanistan, that's something that they've all discovered. It's their special forces do a fantastic job, but they don't have access to the female part of the Afghan population, which, for example, means that when they stop cars to inspect them, they can't inspect the women in the cars. When they do searches or visits at people's homes, they can't speak with the women. That is a big liability. So the way what other countries did was they brought in women from other parts of the armed forces to serve with the special forces. What the Norwegians did was, the basic reality is that the physical tests to get into special forces are so tough that it's exceptionally rare that a woman passes those tests. So what do? Do you lower the bar? Well, then that has significant consequences. So, as I said, what other countries' armed forces did, special forces did, was they invited women from other parts of the armed forces to come with their special forces. But what the Norwegians did was they started an all-female special forces unit where women competed against other women to get in. And I visited the first year of that all-female special forces unit. Those women were exceptionally impressive and just ordinary Norwegian women who were just extraordinarily fit and bright and fantastic soldiers. I think this is the way forward. Experiment and use the width of your talents within your society without dogma. Then another thing I wanted to mention that is also quite experimental, I think other countries can learn from, is Latvia. So Latvia doesn't have national service and is not planning to introduce it, but Latvia wanted to involve its teenagers in the national effort in keeping the country safe. Well, how do you do that? It created a new curriculum, high school curriculum in national defense or national security, where kids now, it's being rolled out across the country. So kids are being taught about the threats that face Lithuania, and they're being taught practical skills that you need if something happens to your country. For example, they learn how to navigate without Google Maps. Who here knows how to navigate without Google Maps? I think we have all forgotten how to do it. We may have been able to do it, or you know how to do it. We may have been able to do it a few years ago, but actually finding your way through an area that doesn't have street signs and where you don't have a map, where you need a compass, it's actually quite intimidating, especially if you have never done it. Well, that's what the Latvians teach their kids now, and they teach them resilience, they teach them teamwork. This is another way of involving the whole population in keeping the country safe. Just one final example, Germany. So Germany is not known as a national defense innovator recently, but the defense minister, AKK as she is called, has just launched this new initiative called Your Year for Germany, where, again, it's a selective program, 1,000 places each year, where young Germans, well, I shouldn't say young Germans, because I think in theory you can be a bit older as well, but the target audience are 19-year-olds, can apply for this Your Year for Germany, where they spend 6 months training with the armed forces. Then they spend the remaining 6 years in their home regions learning about homeland security, exercising homeland security, and taking part in homeland security operations and training. And that again helps keep the country safe, because it's not just some military training where you're sent off to somewhere, then you return home and you forget all about it. This is about being a part of the solution in your home region. So credit to AKK for launching this program. One last initiative that hasn't happened yet, but I hope will happen, because I came up with the idea myself, is something that I call resilience training for teenagers, where teenagers between the penultimate and last year of secondary education would be able to participate, would be invited to participate in 3 weeks of resilience training. So crisis preparedness, crisis response, and information literacy. And it would be incentivized through well, they would get extra points for the university or credits for their university applications. The people who have completed the program, and the people going, or the participants going into the labor market after secondary school, would get tax credits once they start working. And the point again is that this part of our society doesn't need to be sent off to military service, but can be a phenomenal resource in learning the sort of skills that you need if our society is disrupted, which it will, whether it is by a hostile state or by Mother Nature. And that way we won't be completely lost, because we'll have a critical mass of people who know what to do in a crisis, not just for themselves, but for their families as well, and for the local community. And my idea is that they'll assist the blue light services as well. So that's the ambulance services, fire departments, and police departments, so that they can focus on the most critical tasks, and volunteers, i.e. people who have completed resilience training, can take care of the more basic tasks. And I'm delighted that the Scottish National Party has picked up the idea and turned it into an idea they call Resilience Scotland, where people of all ages would be able to get resilience training and be part of this critical mass of people who know what to do in a crisis, which is, again, something that benefits not just them and their local communities, but the country as well. So with that, I'll stop, and happy to discuss and take questions and even ideas, if you have ideas for how to further involve the breadth of our societies in keeping our societies safe.
Thank you, Elizabeth.